A cold Georgia rain fell as Camille Johnson stood on the Whitmore estate porch, clutching her sons while two men in tailored suits hurled their clothes into the mud. The rain clung to her eyelashes, turning the porch light into a halo that felt cruelly out of place, as if mocking her for still standing here. The smell of wet pine from the tall trees mixed with the scent of damp earth, making the moment feel heavier than the sky itself. Just 2 days earlier, she had stood in this very spot beside her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, smiling politely at neighbors who came to pay their respects after his sudden death. That day, grief had been raw, but cushioned by the walls of the home they had built together. Now those walls were guarded by Jonathan's younger brothers, Ronald and Steve, who looked at her not as family, but as an intruder. Ronald's voice was sharp, cutting through the patter of rain. "Miss Johnson," he said deliberately, emphasizing the name as though it were a slur. "This house carries the Whitmore name. It's not a boarding house for outsiders." His pale eyes didn't blink as he spoke, and the corners of his mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Camille's arms tightened around Micah, her youngest, who pressed his face into her coat to hide from the sting of their words. Beside her, Noah and Elias stood rigid, their eyes darting between their uncles and the box of clothes, now soaking in the mud. She could feel their small hands trembling. "I'm not asking for much," Camille said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Just a little time to—" Steve interrupted with a wave of his hand, as though brushing off a pesky fly. "Jonathan didn't leave a will, Camille. Without one, we're the next of kin. The estate, the company, the properties, they all fall to us. You and the boys, you'll have to make other arrangements." His words were cold, but it was the way he looked past her, like she was invisible, that landed the deepest cut. Jonathan had once told her there was a sealed will hidden away for safekeeping, but she knew there was no point saying that now. These men wouldn't listen. They wanted her gone. The rain grew heavier, drumming on the porch roof, as if marking the seconds until she would have no choice but to leave. "Let's be clear," Ronald added, stepping forward so close that she could see the raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. "By sundown, if you're still here, we'll have the sheriff remove you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. The word made her jaw tighten. This wasn't just hard, it was cruel. Yet she knew there was no point in fighting them here, in this moment, in front of her boys. Micah whimpered, and Elias shifted closer to Noah, who lifted his chin in a gesture that made Camille's heart ache. 12 years old, and already trying to be the man of the family. She turned, gathering the boys toward the worn sedan parked at the end of the drive. As she stepped down the porch, her foot slipped slightly on the slick wood, but she caught herself. Behind her, Steve bent down, picked up a small cardboard box, and tossed it onto the top step with a thud. It split open, spilling shirts, socks, and a single photograph of Jonathan holding Noah as a baby. Camille bent to pick up the picture, her fingers shaking. She tucked it carefully into her coat pocket, ignoring the rest. The photo was worth more to her than anything else in that house. The drive from the estate was a blur, pavement slick under the tires, wipers struggling against the downpour. The boys were silent, each lost in his own thoughts. Savannah's streets, usually alive with tourists and the scent of blooming gardenias, felt like a ghost town in the rain. By the time she pulled into a quiet side street, the sky had deepened into a bruised gray. She parked under a street lamp, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle. The ticking of the cooling engine was the only sound. In her mind, she replayed every moment of the last 48 hours. The funeral, the brothers' cold stares, the moment they refused to acknowledge her as Jonathan's wife. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about erasing her and the boys from the Whitmore story entirely. Micah stirred in his booster seat. "Mama, where are we going?" His voice was small, uncertain. She reached back to smooth his damp hair. "Someplace warm, somewhere we can rest tonight." She didn't add that she didn't know exactly where that was. The rain softened into a drizzle as she started the car again, heading toward the city's older district. Street lamps reflected off wet cobblestones, and moss-draped oaks leaned over the road like watchful sentinels. She drove past the familiar diner where Jonathan used to buy them sweet tea on hot afternoons. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. An hour later, she pulled into the gravel drive of the Savannah Women's Shelter. The neon sign flickered against the damp night air, casting a faint pink glow across the windshield. Camille cut the engine, resting her hands on the steering wheel for a moment longer before turning to wake the boys. Noah opened his eyes first, then Elias, both blinking at the strange building. Micah rubbed his fists against his eyes. "Is this home now?" he asked. Camille's throat tightened. "Just for a little while, baby." She stepped out into the mist, lifting Micah into her arms while the older boys grabbed what little they had left. Behind her, the Whitmore estate was miles away, its warm lights hidden by rain and distance. Ahead, a modest brick building promised shelter, if not yet peace. As they walked toward the entrance, Camille felt the weight of the day settle deep in her bones. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not let her boys be written out of their father's legacy. The pink glow from the flickering sign barely cut through the mist. Camille sat still for a moment, watching the raindrops bead and slide down the windshield in uneven lines. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel long after the engine went quiet. The soft sound of her son's breathing filled the car, and for a brief second, she wished she could just let them sleep there forever. No questions, no cold stares, no locked doors. But the damp was already creeping in. She turned to wake Noah first. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the strange glow outside. Elias stirred next, rubbing his arms against the chill, while Micah kept his head on her shoulder, even as she unbuckled his seatbelt. Inside the shelter's entrance, the air smelled faintly of coffee and clean laundry. The front desk was manned by a middle-aged woman in a knit cardigan, her smile warm, but edged with the kind of weariness that comes from hearing too many hard stories. "Evening, ma'am," she greeted softly. "You must be Camille. Mrs. Langley called ahead." Camille's eyebrows lifted. "She did?" "Yes, ma'am. Said you and your boys needed a safe place tonight." She slid a clipboard forward. "Just a bit of paperwork, and then we'll get y'all settled." While Camille signed, the boys huddled near a space heater, their damp shoes squeaking faintly on the tile. She noticed a bulletin board on the wall covered with flyers. Free clinic dates, job listings, church suppers. It was a world away from the polished marble halls of the Whitmore estate, but somehow it felt more honest. They were given a small room, 2 narrow beds, a bunk bed pushed against the wall, and a single dresser that had seen better days. The sheets smelled of lavender detergent, and the radiator rattled as it warmed the space. Micah sat on the lower bunk, his legs dangling, eyes following Camille as she unpacked the few clothes they had. "Mama, why don't Uncle Ronald and Uncle Steve like us?" She paused, her back to him. The answer was too big for a 5-year-old. "Sometimes people don't understand family the way they should," she said gently, "but that's their problem, not ours." Elias piped up from the top bunk. "It's 'cause we're not full Whitmore, right?" His tone was flat, but his eyes searched hers. Camille reached up to squeeze his hand. "You're as much Whitmore as your daddy was, and don't you forget it." A knock came at the open door. Mrs. Langley stood there, her umbrella still dripping onto the hallway carpet. She looked out of place among the shelter's modest surroundings, wearing her Sunday-best coat and carrying a pie tin wrapped in foil. "I figured you hadn't had supper," she said, stepping in without waiting for an answer. She set the pie, pecan, still warm, on the dresser. "Thought this might make the night a little easier." Camille felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you. I don't know what to—" "Hush now," Mrs. Langley cut in kindly. "You just take care of those boys. I'll handle the rest." She lowered her voice. "I told the folks at Child Services what I saw, what they did. Throwing y'all out like that. It's not right. Somebody's got to speak up." For the first time since leaving the estate, Camille felt a flicker of hope. She remembered Jonathan's words from years ago, whispered on a quiet Sunday morning as they folded laundry. "If anything ever happens, there's something you'll need to find." That night, after the boys were asleep, she sat by the small window, listening to the rain ease into a steady drizzle. Across the street, a diner's neon "Open 24 hours" sign buzzed faintly. She thought about slipping over there in the morning, buying the boys pancakes if she could scrape together enough change, maybe leaving a small tip like she and Jonathan always did, habit more than luxury. The next morning came with the smell of bacon drifting from the shelter's kitchen. The boys ate quietly, though Micah perked up when a volunteer offered him extra syrup. After breakfast, Camille walked them across the street to that little diner. The door chimed as they entered, and the warmth hit them instantly, along with the scent of strong coffee. A waitress in her 60s, with hair the color of steel wool and a name tag that read Louise, greeted them with a drawled, "Mornin', sweetheart. Y'all just get in out of that mess?" "Yes, ma'am," Camille said, guiding the boys into a booth. Louise brought 3 short stacks and kept the coffee flowing. Camille slipped 2 crumpled dollar bills under her plate before they left, the way Jonathan used to, never forgetting the tip, no matter how tight things were. Back at the shelter, Mrs. Langley was waiting in the lobby. "Camille, I think I know what your Jonathan meant," she said, without preamble. "He once told me there was something important he kept safe. Said only you would know where to look." Camille's brow furrowed. "He told me the same, but I've never been sure where." Mrs. Langley leaned in, her voice low. "He mentioned a Bible. Said it wasn't for reading, not that one. Does that mean anything to you?" The image flashed in Camille's mind instantly. Jonathan's old leather Bible, the one that had sat untouched on the highest shelf in their bedroom. Her pulse quickened. If the brothers hadn't found it yet, maybe, just maybe, it still held whatever he'd left for her. Mrs. Langley placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Don't wait too long, honey. Things like that, they got a way of disappearing if you do." A hollow thump echoed as Camille lifted the false bottom of Jonathan's old Bible. The sound was small, almost shy, but in the quiet of the storage unit, it struck her like a bell. Dust motes drifted in the narrow cone of light falling from the overhead bulb, and the air was cool with the metallic smell of corrugated walls and old cardboard. Camille's fingers trembled as she eased the false bottom free. Beneath the ribbon of worn leather and onion skin pages lay a shallow compartment she'd never known existed, lined with felt gone threadbare at the corners. In it rested a tiny brass key, the color of old pennies, tucked into an envelope so thin it looked like one more page slipped from the Bible itself. Noah was the first to exhale. He had been holding his breath without realizing it, shoulders raised like a question mark. Elias stood on tiptoe to see, his nose wrinkling at the dust. The storage unit's hallway outside was quiet. Somewhere, far off, a roller door groaned and then settled. A strip of sky at the top of the door, no wider than a bookmark, was cloudy and pale, hinting at a day that hadn't decided yet whether it would be kind. Camille lifted the key. It felt warmer than she expected, as if it had been waiting for her, and for a moment she saw Jonathan's face the way he looked the day they'd moved into the Whitmore estate, coat slung over his shoulder, eyes bright, teasing her that they'd put the Bible on a high shelf because it was safer near heaven. Back then, she'd laughed and told him she'd never reach it without a ladder. He'd promised to fetch it for her whenever she needed. He kept that promise in a way she hadn't understood until now. "Is that it?" Elias asked, voice just above a whisper, as though a loud word might scare away their luck. "I think so," she said, her own voice steadying because theirs needed hers to be. "Your daddy told me there was a key only I'd know where to find. This is it." Noah's gaze flicked to the rows of boxes around them, labels she and Jonathan had written together in thick marker. Christmas lights, baby clothes, Micah, work files, J.W., winter coats, photo albums. "What does the key open?" he asked. Camille turned the brass between her fingers. On its bow, a tiny engraving, W.E., the same initials stamped on some of the old luggage from the estate. The teeth were short, delicate, like a music box key. She scanned the unit, the metal shelves, the floor safe Jonathan had once kept papers in, the battered steel locker in the back corner that had stubbornly kept its secrets for years. That cabinet, she said, almost to herself. It was tall and square, paint peeling at the edges, a relic from Jonathan's first office, salvaged when they outgrew it. He'd always kept it locked, telling her it was where he stored things that matter and things that can't get wet. She remembered teasing him once about the phrasing. What could be more can't get wet than important papers? And he'd grinned, saying, "You'd be surprised, Camille. Some things turn to salt if you cry on them." She moved toward the locker, the key warm now from the heat of her palm. Noah followed, then Elias, each step echoing in the small space. Micah wasn't with them. He was back at the shelter with a volunteer who had offered to read to him that morning, so the unit felt oddly hushed, stripped of his high little voice and the quickness of his questions. Camille felt both lighter and lonelier without him. The lock was an old cylinder set into the door with a lip of tarnished brass. She pressed the key in, not daring to hope, and felt the tiny teeth catch, then slide, then seat with a quiet, satisfying click. Her breath caught. She turned the key clockwise. For a second it resisted. Then the mechanism yielded with a soft, internal clunk, like a heart knocking against a rib. The door opened on a breath no one was holding anymore. Inside, shelves held neat stacks of waterproof document pouches, a small fireproof box, and a few items that made her smile in spite of herself. A photograph of the boys at Tybee Beach with sand on their knees and ice cream mustaches. The pressed magnolia bloom she'd carried in her hair the day Jonathan proposed, beneath a live oak dripping with Spanish moss. A postcard from a business trip he'd taken years ago, the back of it scrawled with, "Wish you were here. Turns out I only like sunsets when you're in 'em." "Whoa," Elias said, peering around her. "That's a lot of boring stuff." "Sometimes boring keeps families together," Camille said, and then she reached for the small fireproof box. It was heavier than it looked, cool to the touch, and embossed with raised lettering that felt like braille under her fingertips. "Sargent and Lowell, fire-resistant document safe." She glanced at Noah. "You want to do the honors?" He nodded, solemn as a deacon, and took the box to the low workbench along the wall. The key she'd used for the locker wouldn't fit here, a different cut and a different lock. Camille checked the envelope from the Bible again. Another, even smaller key fell. The tiny key glinted in her palm, so light it almost felt like nothing at all. She handed it to Noah, who slid it into the lock on the fireproof box. The key turned with a quiet snap, and a faint whiff of cedar and paper rose as the lid lifted. Inside, under a layer of protective cloth, lay a thick envelope sealed with 2 embossed notary stamps. Across the front, in Jonathan's strong, even handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only by Judge Mason, Chatham County Supreme Court." Camille's breath hitched. She traced the letters with her fingertip as though touching him. "Is that Daddy's writing?" Elias asked, leaning in. "Yes," she said softly. "It's his." Noah glanced at her, eyes wide. "Mama, what's in it?" She shook her head. "Not for us to open, but I think this is what's going to change everything." Beneath the envelope was a smaller folder labeled Personal. Inside were copies of incorporation papers for Whitmore Enterprises, a handwritten list of bank accounts, and a flash drive. Paperclipped to the folder's front was a note in Jonathan's handwriting. "If you're reading this, Camille, it means I couldn't get back to you. Trust Mason, trust Linda, and remember, what we built is yours and the boys', no one else's." Camille's vision blurred. She closed the folder gently, tucking it back under the envelope. She knew Judge Mason by name. A man known in Savannah for being fair, even stubbornly so. Linda must be Linda Avery, the attorney Jonathan had occasionally mentioned. Elias touched the flash drive. "Can we see what's on it?" "Not here," she said. First, we have to keep it safe, and then we'll make sure the right people see it." They packed the envelope, folder, and flash drive into Camille's tote bag, wrapping them in an old sweater. When she turned to close the locker, she noticed something taped to the inside of the door, a photograph of her and Jonathan, taken in their kitchen one summer afternoon. She was laughing, head tilted back, while he flipped pancakes at the stove. On the back, in blue ink, were 4 words: "You'll know when." Her throat tightened. She took the photo, slid it into her coat pocket, and locked the cabinet. Back at the shelter, Mrs. Langley was waiting in the lounge, a mug of coffee in her hands. "Well?" she asked. Camille didn't speak at first, just nodded and held up the tote bag. "I think I found what Jonathan meant." Mrs. Langley's lips pressed into a firm line. "Then you'd best move quick, before those brothers of his find a way to make it disappear." That night, after the boys were asleep, Camille sat at the small desk in their room and opened the flash drive on the shelter's old laptop. 2 files appeared. One marked statement and another marked video. She clicked the video. Jonathan's face filled the screen, calm, steady, speaking directly to the camera. "If you're seeing this, Camille, I'm sorry. It means something's happened to me." He paused, his eyes softening. "I've put everything in writing. My will, the company documents, our accounts. It's all in the envelope for Judge Mason. You and the boys get everything. My shares, my savings, the house, the lake property, even the foundation. No one else." Her hand covered her mouth. Jonathan's voice continued, firmer now. "If Ronald or Steve try to interfere, the clause I added will trigger immediate court review. They don't know about it, and they won't see it coming. I trust you to protect what's ours." The video ended, and Camille sat in the quiet hum of the old laptop, the weight of both grief and resolve pressing on her. She knew now what she had to do: get the envelope to Judge Mason, no matter what. The next morning she called the courthouse, requesting an appointment. The clerk hesitated when she gave her name, but when Camille mentioned the sealed envelope for Judge Mason, there was a pause, then a low, "You'd better bring that in right away." As she hung up, the rain outside began again, soft, steady, like the sound of a clock counting down. Camille had dressed simply, a pressed gray dress, low heels, and the same pearl earrings Jonathan had given her on their 5th anniversary. The air was cool and damp, and her breath made small clouds as she exhaled. Each step toward the courthouse felt heavier than the last, not from the weight of her tote bag, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. Noah and Elias walked just ahead of her, their collared shirts slightly wrinkled from the shelter's laundry room, but their chins lifted with quiet determination. Micah held her hand, swinging it gently as though this were just another morning stroll. At the top of the steps, a uniformed bailiff opened the courthouse door. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a polite nod. His southern drawl was softer than Ronald or Steve's, warmer, and it steadied her just a little. Inside, the scent of old wood and polished brass filled the air. The courtroom itself was high-ceilinged with tall windows that let in gray light. A low murmur filled the room, attorneys shuffling papers, reporters adjusting cameras, the occasional creak of a bench. Ronald and Steve were already seated at the defense table. Ronald's suit was sharp, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed unease. Steve leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes flicking toward Camille and then away, as if looking at her might set off some trap. Judge Mason entered promptly at 9. He was tall, with a head of close-cropped silver hair and a face lined by years of listening to too many lies. The gavel's sharp rap brought the room to attention. "This court will come to order," Mason said. His voice carried the weight of someone who didn't tolerate nonsense. "We are here to determine the rightful heirs to the estate of the late Jonathan Whitmore." Steve's attorney rose first, launching into a statement about procedural irregularities and lack of documented marriage. It was all delivered in a tone just shy of condescension, the kind that assumed the judge shared their skepticism. Camille's attorney, Linda Avery, a woman in her 50s with keen eyes and a calm presence, stood only after the defense had exhausted its posturing. She walked to the center of the room with an ease that came from decades of fighting uphill battles. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about procedure. It is about the deliberate erasure of a widow and her children from the legacy their husband and father built, and we have the evidence to prove it." Camille reached into her tote bag, pulling out the fireproof envelope. Linda took it, holding it up so the gold notary seals caught the light. The murmuring in the room grew louder. "This," Linda continued, "is the sealed last will and testament of Jonathan Whitmore, notarized and entrusted solely to Judge Mason for delivery in the event of foul play or family interference." Judge Mason's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Bailiff, bring it here." The envelope was carried to the bench. Mason broke the seals with a small blade, sliding the documents free. For several minutes, the only sound in the courtroom was the turning of pages. Then Mason looked up, his expression unreadable. "The deceased acknowledges Camille Johnson Whitmore as his legal spouse," he said evenly, "and names her and their children as the exclusive beneficiaries of an estate currently valued at," he glanced at the appraisal sheet, "just over $100 million. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Somewhere a reporter's pen scratched frantically. Steve's jaw dropped. Ronald's face went pale. Linda waited for the murmurs to fade before nodding to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights. On the courtroom screen appeared Jonathan's face, the video Camille had watched in the shelter. His voice was steady as he named Camille and each child, one by one, as inheritors of everything he owned. When the video ended, the silence was thick. "Your Honor," Linda said, "we also have incorporation papers, account statements, and a series of emails between the defendants and a private attorney discussing the removal of all spousal references from corporate records. This was not confusion. It was a calculated attempt to defraud the rightful heirs." Mason's gaze hardened as he looked at Ronald and Steve. "We will hear witness testimony after recess." As the gavel struck, reporters surged toward the doors, their whispers a mix of $100 million and family betrayal. Camille gathered her boys, leading them past the defense table without a word. Outside the courtroom, Mrs. Langley was waiting on a bench, a thermos of sweet tea in her hands. "Y'all did good in there," she said, handing Camille the warm drink. "Now, let the truth do the rest." Camille sipped, the sweetness grounding her. She looked back toward the closed courtroom doors, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk said, as Mrs. Langley adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Langley cleared her throat, the kind of little sound church ladies make before reading a psalm. "Helen Louise Langley," she answered, voice steady, 81 years old, resident of Whitaker Street in Savannah, Georgia. She folded her hands on her purse as if she were at a social, not on a witness stand, and offered the judge a polite nod. Linda Avery approached with a kindly smile that didn't soften the steel in her questions. "Mrs. Langley, do you know the plaintiff, Mrs. Camille Johnson?" "I surely do," Mrs. Langley said, directing a quick glance toward Camille. "She's my neighbor. I've watched those boys of hers grow like spring corn." Her eyes moved to Noah and Elias in the gallery. Both sat up a little taller. "Can you tell the court what you observed on the evening of—" Linda checked her notes. "October 22nd at the Whitmore estate?" Mrs. Langley adjusted her glasses, and the jurors leaned in. "It was raining the way it does when the weather can't make up its mind. Heavy than light, heavy than light. I was bringing a casserole, like folks do after a funeral. When I got to the porch, I saw Mr. Ronald and Mr. Steve." She paused as though choosing her words with care. "They were unkind." "Unkind how?" "They told Camille and them babies to get out, said the house had the Whitmore name on it, and that there wasn't no will." She inhaled slowly. "Ma'am, I know grief makes people say foolish things, but this wasn't grief. This was intention." On the defense table, Steve rolled his eyes. Ronald stared at a distant spot on the wall. Linda's tone stayed even. What did you do then? I called the women's shelter, Mrs. Langley said, hands still folded, and child services. Not to make trouble, just to make sure those boys had beds that night. I'd do it again today. She glanced at the judge. Your Honor, I'm old, but I know wrong when I see it. Objection, the defense attorney said smoothly. Speculation and moralizing. Sustained, Judge Mason replied. The witness's conclusions will be stricken. The factual account stands. Mrs. Langley nodded, unoffended, as if she, too, respected the rules of the room. Linda stepped back. No further questions. The defense attorney approached, a smile thin enough to cut paper. Mrs. Langley, you said you brought a casserole. Yes, sir, chicken and rice. Delicious, I'm sure. You care for Mrs. Johnson and her children. Would it be fair to say you're emotionally invested? Mrs. Langley blinked. Son, at my age, I'm emotionally invested in everybody. A ripple of low laughter passed through the courtroom. She didn't wait to be prompted. But I didn't make anyone say the words I heard. I just called them in. The attorney's smile faltered. No further questions. When she stepped down, Camille caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you, Mrs." Langley pressed a palm to her heart and returned to her seat, pulling a small tin of peppermints from her purse, as if normalcy could be handed out like candy. Linda rose again. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Mr. Martin Goldstein. A man in his 50s, compact and neat, approached the stand with a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen more than its share of long days. He was sworn in, recited his name, and sat, placing the briefcase on his lap like a trusted dog. Mr. Goldstein, Linda said, what was your professional relationship with the late Jonathan Whitmore? I was his corporate counsel from the early days, Goldstein replied, voice clipped and precise. I helped form Whitmore Enterprises, drafted shareholder agreements, and more recently, advised him on estate planning. Did you draft the will the court has just reviewed? Goldstein took a breath. I did, with Mr. Whitmore's direction. It was executed, notarized, and sealed with instructions that, in the event of family interference or suspected foul play, it be delivered directly to the presiding judge. Linda turned to the screen as the bailiff dimmed the lights again. Mr. Goldstein, did Mr. Whitmore leave any recorded statements? He did, Goldstein said. A series of videos and a signed statement time-stamped. He wanted no ambiguity. The video flickered on. Jonathan at his desk, wearing a soft blue shirt, a hint of evening light on his shoulder. The room stilled the way rooms do when a voice from the past enters them. If you're seeing this, Jonathan said, then the documents attached to this recording are to be considered my final intent. He looked straight into the camera, into Camille again, into the jurors now witnessing a conversation he had prepared for them. He named Camille, my wife, and each child by full name then, with that same steady tone, added, no one else. This was different from the shorter clip the court had glimpsed earlier. This version included a longer segment, Jonathan explaining the share distribution, the Foundation's mission, and a clause labeled emergency activation, which required immediate court review if anyone attempted to suppress spousal records or misrepresent marital status. The clause was clear enough that even those without legal training could feel its bite. When the screen went dark, the defense table seemed to shrink. Linda paced the slow, confident few steps of an attorney who knows the ground beneath her feet. Mr. Goldstein, please describe Exhibit D, the email chain you submitted. Goldstein opened his briefcase and took out a folder. These are emails between Mr. Ronald Whitmore, Mr. Stephen Whitmore, and an attorney not affiliated with Whitmore Enterprises. In them, the parties discuss removing spousal references, scrubbing records, and streamlining succession to avoid complications. He looked up. The dates are within a week of Mr. Whitmore's death. Objection, the defense attorney said quickly, hearsay and taken out of context. Overruled as to the emails themselves, Judge Mason said, eyes flicking over the pages. They are admissions by a party opponent. Context will be considered. Linda approached the witness box. Mr. Goldstein, did Mr. Whitmore ever express concern about his brothers attempting to control his company or estate? He did, Goldstein replied. That's why we drafted the emergency activation clause. He wanted the court to step in if necessary. Across the aisle, Ronald shifted, finally speaking up in a hoarse whisper that carried farther than he intended. He never trusted us. Silence snowballed. The defense attorney laid a hand on Ronald's sleeve, but the damage was done. The jurors had heard the strain, the hurt, and perhaps the hint of self-knowledge that often arrives too late. Linda nodded to the bailiff. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we call our next witness. Proceed, Judge Mason said. Camille Johnson. Camille rose. She smoothed her dress, felt the familiar coolness of Pearl at her ears, and walked forward. The oath tasted dry on her tongue, but she spoke it without a tremor. Mrs. Johnson, Linda began gently, how long were you and Mr. Whitmore married? 9 years, Camille said. Almost 10. And during those years, did you participate in Whitmore Enterprises? I did, she answered. Not as an executive, but Jonathan brought work home. We planned together, the charity, the scholarships. She paused. We chose things that felt like building, not just buying. Linda let that linger before moving on. Did Jonathan ever tell you he feared interference from his brothers? Camille's eyes lowered for a heartbeat, then lifted. Yes, he loved them, but there were differences. He thought they might push me and the boys aside if anything happened to him. Thank you. Linda stepped back. No further questions. The defense attorney stood, smoothing his tie as though that could iron the wrinkles out of the day. Mrs. Johnson, you refer to yourself as Mrs. Whitmore, but your driver's license says Johnson. Why is that? Camille didn't flinch. Because I kept my own name for work. Many women do. So you never legally changed your name? My marriage license says we were married, she said evenly. Names don't make a marriage. Truth does. The attorney's lips tightened. You're a school teacher, correct? Not a business professional? I'm a mother and a citizen under oath, Camille replied, and I listened when my husband told me what to do if something happened to him. A rustle of approval moved through the gallery, as soft as wind in live oaks. The attorney tried a new angle. Isn't it true that Mr. Whitmore's brothers supported the company in its early days? That their family name opened doors? Camille folded her hands. I don't doubt they helped early on, but the doors Jonathan walked through, he held open for others. That's why we built a foundation. No further questions, the attorney said, returning to his seat with the air of a man who had walked into a room and missed the only chair. Linda called one last witness, a junior accountant from the company who testified, haltingly at first, then with increasing clarity, that Ronald had requested certain database fields be temporarily hidden the week after Jonathan's funeral. The jurors took notes with a kind of slow, sinking absorption that doesn't bode well for defendants. By mid-afternoon, the air in the courtroom felt both tired and electric. Linda returned to the lectern, one palm on a stack of documents, the other slightly open, as though offering the jurors a choice they already knew how to make. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, we Americans like to talk about justice as if it were a grand thing that happens in marble halls. Sometimes it is. Sometimes, though, it's as plain as a casserole on a rainy night and a neighbor who won't look away. She gestured subtly toward Mrs. Langley. This isn't a story about fortune falling from the sky. It's about a family that tried to cut a mother and her children out of their own lives. You've seen the will. You've watched the video. You've read the emails. This was not confusion. This was a plan. She paced once, slow and deliberate. When Mr. Whitmore said no one else, he wasn't being dramatic. He was protecting his wife and kids. He was protecting the mission of a company that gives scholarships, funds clinics, and keeps the lights on for people who need it. If words mean anything in this room, then let us mean what he said them to mean. The defense attorney rose for his turn, but the rhythm of the day wasn't his anymore. He spoke of misunderstandings, of family grief, of best intentions. He nodded toward Ronald and Steve, their faces drawn tight, as if proximity to suffering might smudge their edges into something sympathetic. A juror in the second row tapped his pen. Another rested her chin on her hand without blinking. When he finished, all the air seemed to leave the room at once, and what remained was the rustle of people returning to their own weight. Judge Mason leaned forward. Before we proceed to the jury instructions, I have 2 clarifying questions for counsel. He asked about the emergency activation clause and about the chain of custody for the sealed envelope. Linda answered both cleanly. Goldstein supplied dates and signatures that fit together like dovetailed joints. Mason nodded, satisfied, then looked at Camille. Mrs. Johnson, I recognize the strength it takes to sit in this room and let strangers weigh your life. Whatever this court decides, you conducted yourself with dignity. Camille felt something ease inside her. She couldn't name it, but she knew she would remember the way he said dignity, not as a pat on the head, but as a fact. The gavel tapped once. We will take a brief recess before closing instructions. In the hallway, the courthouse hummed like a beehive. Reporters waited at the bottom of the stairwell, but the bailiff kept them back with a gentle arm. Mrs. Langley pressed a peppermint into Noah's hand. He offered it to Micah, who broke it in 2 with the solemnity of a sacrament and gave his brother the bigger piece. Ronald and Steve stood near a pillar, speaking in low, sharp tones to their attorney. Steve's face had a chalky look now. The bravado leached out. Ronald rubbed at his wedding ring as if it were a worrystone. For a heartbeat, he glanced over at Camille. There was something like recognition in his eyes, of her resolve maybe, or of the fact that the line between family and outsider had never really been a line at all, just a story he told himself until it cracked. Don't look, Linda murmured, guiding Camille toward a bench. We're almost there. Camille nodded. She poured a little water from a paper cup for Micah and watched Elias fold the jury instruction leaflet into a paper airplane for his little brother. Then thought better of it and smoothed the page again, cheeks flushing when he caught the bailiff's eye. The bailiff winked like a grandfather who'd seen worse. When they returned to the courtroom, the gray outside had softened to a pearly light. The room felt changed, as rooms do when an afternoon has done its work. Linda gave her closing, not with fireworks, but with that same steady hand that had moved through the day. She spoke of law and of promises, of the way a signature binds a person to their word. She reminded the jurors that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it's the hush after a truth lands. Then came the moment that stories hinge on even when no one says so. Linda lifted the appraisal sheet one more time. The estate's value is just over $100 million, she repeated, not as a headline, but as a number that translated into college degrees, clinic lights, and a house where boys could sleep without rain in their shoes. A small sound moved through the room, an intake of breath, a pen dropped, a groan somewhere in the gallery like a bench settling under a different weight. She let the number sit, then lowered the page. But the value before you isn't the money. It's whether a man's spoken intent means what it says, and whether a mother and her sons get to keep the name they already live. She stepped back. Your honor. Judge Mason looked down at the bench for a long second, the way a person stares at a horizon that refuses to be hurried. He lifted his gaze to the jurors, then to the attorneys, then let it rest, briefly, on Camille. Something almost like surprise crossed his face, as if the shape of the day had arranged itself into a pattern even a careful man had not anticipated. He tapped the appraisal page with one finger, then the notarized will, then the chain of custody log. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make the room lean forward. This changes everything. The jury foreman rose, holding the folded verdict form like something fragile. The courtroom's hum vanished. Even the rain against the tall windows seemed to pause. Judge Mason nodded once. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, the foreman said, voice steady. He handed the envelope to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. Mason unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the lines, then read aloud. In favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Camille Johnson Whitmore and her 3 minor children. Full estate to be restored. Punitive damages awarded. Criminal investigation recommended for Ronald Whitmore and Stephen Whitmore. The words struck the air like church bells. There were no cheers, just a long collective exhale. Relief mingled with the awe of finality. Steve collapsed back into his chair. Ronald's hands trembled as 2 deputies stepped forward. Camille sat still for a heartbeat, the weight of years pressing on her shoulders, before Micah climbed into her lap and whispered, "We're safe now, Mama." She held him close, her eyes closing against the tide of gratitude. Across the aisle, Linda Avery rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. Judge Mason cleared his throat. "Let this serve as a reminder," he said, "that money may build walls, but truth breaks through them, sometimes through the voice of a child, sometimes through the resilience of a mother." When court adjourned, the hallway beyond the double doors erupted into movement. Reporters, camera flashes, and curious onlookers parting as Camille and her boys stepped out. But instead of shouted questions, there was a hush of respect. A young journalist stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, what will you do now?" Camille smiled through tears. "We're going to start fresh, build something in Jonathan's name, and teach the boys that love is louder than any lie." They didn't go back to the Whitmore estate that day. Instead, Camille drove them to the modest house she'd rented on the edge of the historic district, its porch wrapped in climbing jasmine. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Within weeks, legal transfers were completed. Camille met with accountants, signed documents, and, true to her word, began shaping a foundation in Jonathan's name. The first mission: scholarships for underprivileged youth in Savannah, with a focus on supporting the Black community where Jonathan's mother had once taught. At the shelter, Camille returned to speak with the women still staying there. She donated funds for repairs, fresh linens, and a new computer lab. "Opportunities," she told the shelter director, "are seeds. You can't just hand them over. You've got to plant them where they'll grow." One afternoon, she walked into a neighborhood center on the south side where a mural of smiling faces stretched across the wall. Kids were painting, playing basketball, doing homework at long tables. The director, a tall woman named Mariah, hugged Camille. "Word travels fast," Mariah said. "What you're doing here means a lot, especially to the Black community that's been fighting to keep these doors open." Camille looked around at the children. "Jonathan would have wanted them to know they matter," she said. "Not someday, today." Months passed. Spring brought the scent of azaleas to the air and Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. Camille took the boys to Tybee Beach, where they built sandcastles and laughed when the tide stole them away. The grief never left entirely, but it softened at the edges, becoming part of their story instead of the whole of it. On the anniversary of the verdict, the foundation held its first scholarship banquet at a restored theater downtown. The room was filled with families, educators, and community leaders. A local jazz quartet played softly as dinner was served. Camille took the stage in a simple navy dress, the pearls at her ears catching the light. "A year ago," she began, "my boys and I were sleeping in a shelter, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Today, because of the truth, and because of this city's willingness to hear it, we are here, honoring the potential in each of you." She gestured toward the front row where 10 scholarship recipients sat. "You are the future architects, teachers, engineers, and artists of Savannah. Some of you will return here to lead, to inspire, to protect what we've built together. And I hope you remember that your success is also the success of the Black community that stands behind you." Applause rose, warm and sustained. Camille saw Mrs. Langley in the crowd, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and Linda Avery standing with her arms crossed, smiling like someone who'd just watched a seed blossom. Later that night, Back on her porch, Camille sat with a cup of sweet tea listening to the cicadas. Noah was inside, reading. Elias was sketching in a notebook. Micah was already asleep. The jasmine swayed in the breeze, carrying the scent of home. She thought of Jonathan, not the loss, but the life they'd shared and the legacy they'd built. She thought of the courtroom, the faces of the jurors, the weight of the gavel. And she thought of the words she'd told the boys on the courthouse steps. Love is louder than any lie. In the quiet, with the night wrapped around her, Camille knew they were more than safe. They were rooted. And in Savannah, stories like theirs would be told for years, not as a tale of money, but of truth, of family, and of a mother who refused to be erased. In Camille's story, winning in court was never just about reclaiming property. It was about proving a truth. Justice doesn't always come from the loudest voice, but from the most steadfast one. She stood her ground not only for herself, but for a legacy, Jonathan's love, and his belief that truth can outlast any attempt to erase it. From walking away from her home in the pouring rain to standing on stage at a scholarship banquet, her journey reminds us that when you protect your own rights, you're also clearing a path for others to walk through. Camille understood that a personal victory has to become a shared gain. That's why she directed her resources toward education and community development, especially within the Black community in Savannah, where dreams are often limited by economic barriers and social bias. Key takeaways. Never stay silent when your rights are under attack. Silence only feeds injustice. Prepare ahead of time. Jonathan did this by creating a will, adding an emergency activation clause, and trusting the right people. Turn victory into lasting change, just as Camille invested in scholarships and legal support for vulnerable families. Today, the foundation in Jonathan's name doesn't just send dozens of students to college. It funds neighborhood centers, job training programs, and free legal clinics for the Black community in and around Savannah. This story is a reminder that every time one person in the Black community rises above injustice, the entire community rises with them. And the truest legacy isn't measured in millions of dollars. It's measured in lives changed through courage and resolve.